You're very welcome back. Now, although many of us take our parents and our children for granted, there are thousands of children and adults across Ireland that are adopted or have given their children up for adoption. Many of these adopted Irish people are denied access to information about themselves under legislation enacted more than 50 years ago.
Now, with us this morning is Conall who investigated in a two-day series on adoption in Ireland for the Irish Examiner, and also Susan Lohan, who you met before in the programme, and she has been looking for her natural father on and off over 20 years, but concertedly for the last 8, and she is also part of the Adoption Rights Alliance. Good morning to both of you.
Morning, guys.
Susan, we'll start with you. We've heard your story before in part, but it's come to a head again now because of this 2009 adoption bill, which everybody involved in the process, all the adoption rights, all of the counselling groups around it, even the adoption boards themselves, and the previous minister who occupied that, have all recommended that there's one vital piece of legislation which should be in there, which is the right of medical histories for adoptive children and people. This current minister has not included that in this, and this is causing a lot of controversy and an awful lot of unnecessary anguish.
Indeed. It's mind-boggling to those of us who've been involved in peer support and advocating for adopted people's rights for more than a decade now, as to why he's taken this particular decision. He's even chosen to ignore the government's own appointed adoption board, which in 2003, when Brian Lenihan was Minister for Children, set out what they would like to see enshrined in legislation. They called for, in 2003, open unfettered access to all adoption records for adopted people. Now, one can only speculate as to why he's not doing that. His most recent excuse in the Dáil was that the adoption board hadn't had sufficient time to become expert in tracing for children born overseas, and because of that lack of expertise, he wasn't prepared to bring legislation to the Dáil just yet. So therefore the 42,000 plus of us affected by the domestic legislation are left to languish yet again. OK, Conall, you in the article that you did, you had a practical example and story of how that can endanger somebody's life.
Yeah, I had an example of a woman who actually, strangely enough, from all the adopted people you talked to, she actually managed to trace her mother, her natural mother. But prior to that, she had her son, her 5-year-old son, had to go to hospital, suffered a severe allergic reaction to the anaesthetic. His life actually hung in the balance for a while. The doctors came to both her and her husband looking for medical information as to their medical history. The father had no problem. Of course, she sat there and went, I've no idea, I don't know anything. So she attempted to contact the agency. The agency told her, under no circumstances are we going to open the file and give you that information. She said, I need this, my son is severely ill. The doctor spoke to the agency and got even less satisfaction from them. So her next option was they had to take a muscle biopsy from both her and her children, and luckily everything turned out well in the end. And
in the meantime, of course, time is passing and the child's condition is deteriorating.
Of course, and she, as she said herself, she was in bits. She didn't know what to do, she didn't know who to turn to. They actually told her to write a letter and she'd go on the waiting list.
While her son was seriously sick in hospital.
Yeah.
But what's ludicrous is that the doctor didn't even get access to that. I mean, I can understand if they're saying, right, we don't want somebody else to know kind of thing, but a doctor is just medical information. That's what seems so ludicrous about this.
And that was the point. She wasn't looking for names or details or information. She said, I didn't care about any of that. I wanted my medical background to potentially save a life, and that wasn't forthcoming.
Susan, I know you're not a lawyer, but I mean, God forbid anything had happened to that child. Where would the legal responsibility have lain? I mean, I know where the moral responsibility would have lain, but legally, how could they have stood over that decision?
Well, I honestly don't know, because the 1952 Adoption Act, which we're still labouring under,
beholden to, really.
We are. That actually sets out penalties, for agencies who aren't behaving in a proper manner, as a registered adoption agency should. Although the Adoption Board have yet to provide Adoption Rights Alliance with a list of the criteria that they do set out for a registered adoption agency. But I think the Minister for Children, Barry Andrews in this instance, has really got to step up to the mark. He's got to listen to international commentary on this, best practice recommendations from all around the world. And I'm genuinely perplexed as to why he's not doing this, and he hasn't explained himself satisfactorily to groups such as Adoption Rights Alliance, to Adoption Loss, which is the Natural Parents Network. groups, even such as Bernardo's, have joined us in a coalition to lobby the Minister to reconsider this. And Bernardo's, believe it or not, have received lottery money to publish the latest version of the Contact Preference Register leaflet, which hopefully will be distributed around the country. So the Adoption Board are outsourcing services to groups such as Bernardo's, who they obviously hold in very high regard, but yet are, on this very critical point, are choosing to ignore their advice.
Susan, just for those who aren't familiar with your story, could you tell us a little bit about your search for your parents?
Right, well, I sought information on my natural mother back in the early 80s. I would have been perhaps 21. And I would have been regarded as an early searcher. So, believe it or not, I found my natural mother very, very easily, because the agency, St Patrick's Guild, that I was dealing then, still employed social workers at that time, because in the 1980s, registered adoption agencies were still involved in Ireland with placing Irish children. So the social worker, a lay social worker, was perfectly professional in her dealings with me. I was lucky she found my mother very quickly because she happened to be living at the same address. We met, we were in touch for 13 years until she died, unfortunately, in 2000. Now, it was in 2000, after her death, that I started really in earnest looking for my natural father. And that's when I discovered the brick wall, the system which exists today. And, you know, the cases that Conall has described, I could have written those letters. I could have described those emotions back in 2001.
Because you never found your father, Susan, and you suspect he may now have passed.
Yes. Now, it's a problematic issue. I had one name for my natural mother, but I was fairly certain that there was another name on the adoption file, and that did prove to be the case. Now, the problem is the Adoption Board, the Department of Health, and all of the registered adoption agencies over the years conspired to ensure that fathers' names were left off the birth certs of children born out of marriage. So I would say it's nearly 100% of us do not know our father's names from our birth certs.
Okay, very quickly before we go, Conall, it's a very fine piece of journalism. Congratulations to you and the paper indeed. As an impartial or detached observer, any conclusion that you've come to having gone through it?
I think the lack of legislation seems to be a huge problem that rings through all the stories. I mean, Tressa Reeve's story, where her son was illegally adopted, birth was falsely registered.
50 years to be acknowledged.
Yeah, she still has never met her son. Her son doesn't know he's adopted, has no idea. His birth cert says
she had a child stolen off,
essentially, yeah. And I mean, she's no right to any of that information unless the legislation changes and unless the files become open.
Okay. Well, Conall, we can read your further investigations in the Examiner. Thank you very much. And Susan, thank you again.
Okay, let's go outside to Aidan now.